Thank you all for staying here to the end. I really appreciate it. So in recognition of your staying here, I will make one very brief announcement as we begin our panel. The first is that I appreciate all of the participation from everybody here at the first Africa Open Data Conference. And I wanted to make sure that you knew that we are interested in hearing who might want to have the second Africa Open Data Conference. So if any of you have ideas, suggestions, want to volunteer, are interested in putting together a proposal, please contact me. We're going to be thinking about what might work for finding a fair way of sort of passing on the torch. And so please contact me either now, well, not this immediate minute, today or after the conference. So we have talked a lot about what is being done in open data. Here on this panel, we're actually going to explore the future of open data. So we'll hear about new technologies, new opportunities, new visions, new dreams that can help to inspire you as you go home with takeaways from this conference to understand how you can put into action the things you heard about today, the things you heard about this week. And to start us off with sort of a comprehensive view of the future is Edward Anderson with the World Bank Group here in Tanzania.
Good afternoon. So thank you, Jean. My name is Edward Anderson. I work with the World Bank based here in Tanzania, and I'm a senior ICT policy specialist, but I really focus on innovation and transformation. So I have, I think, no real authority to tell Africa what the future of open data is, but rather I think what I'm hoping to do is ask the question from a variety of perspectives from around the world. I have some experience working with open government data initiatives in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So to, I think, frame our thinking on what the future might look like, I want to pose the question to our participants today from a variety of perspectives. So the first one is really about the volume of data that governments are releasing. And you've heard about this Global Open Data Index. And what we can see, this is now the second year that there's data on the index. And if you switch between 2013 and 2014, the number of data sets, the number of governments is really increasing, and that's fantastic. But the percentage of data sets that are really qualified as completely open has gone down from 15% to 11%. So we're seeing around the world a general trend to put more things online, more things available, but perhaps the quality of that data isn't improving in tune with the volume of that data. The other thing we'd love to see, of course, now that Africa is beginning this conversation, this journey, there's several countries already making progress, and I noticed that South Africa has come up quite a long way in the last year. But we'd love to see many more of the other African countries really come up this index and begin taking a leadership role in some of these segments. The final point to point out, I think, is the sectors in terms of volumes of data. We have in here an implicit framework for what we think governments are trying to do. I'm not sure if this is necessarily the correct frame, but certainly we have more than just national statistics. So open government data, we expect to see in those countries that are really leading the way are releasing legislation data. They're releasing locations, addresses, maps, company registers, election results, timetables for transportation networks, budgets, expenditures. So I think certainly one perspective of the future of open data is more data from more sectors in all forms. But the other perspective is quality of data. What's the future of open data formats and open data quality? So I'm not sure if any of you really had a chance to hear about the 5 stars of open data, but this is another perspective, and it really focuses on what do we really mean by an open format. And I think most of the conversation, certainly in many of the countries we worked in, has been about how do we move from a basic mass publishing paradigm of let's put a PDF report on the web so many people can download it, towards a mass participation paradigm of let's allow lots of people to interact with it, share it, move it around automatically. So these machine-readable formats we talk about, structured data, many of the open data initiatives are looking at releasing tabular data as an Excel file, or even better as a non-proprietary format. So CSV, and I'm very proud that Tanzania has been releasing a lot of data as CSV formats, which is the sort of very simple, common file format that allows any kind of software, it doesn't have to be a Microsoft product, to open and read that data. But CSV formats are really sort of 3-star data, so when we think about the future, some perspectives are about how do you make this 4 stars and 5 stars, and what does that mean? And in this scale, what that means is linked data. And they really mean about having a data set connected to other information, having its own unique address. It's called a URI code. So just like websites have URLs, data sets can have URIs. And when you think about something like a weather data set, it's great if you publish the weather in a machine-readable format. But even greater if people can link to it, and if you can link to other things. So I can publish the weather at Stone Town, Zanzibar. If I know it's a weather data set, as it updates, my application can update. If I know it's the location of Stone Town, I can maybe combine it with other data, like data about a music festival, data about hotels and prices, about tourist destinations. So this is what we call linked data, and some people, Tim Berners-Lee really talks about the semantic web, where data have context because they're linked together. A third perspective, and I was quite impressed with the vision of the e-government agency last night. I talked to the CEO, Dr. Bakari, and he says that what they really want to do now that they have the open data portal is connect to citizens via mobile. So in Africa, most people connect to the internet via the mobile phone. And in fact, most mobile phones aren't even smartphones, they're feature phones, SMS. So this is the notion of the app economy. How do we translate data into applications, and how do we go mobile? And what you see is some governments have begun to have app repositories, app stores around their open data initiatives. And what does it mean to have an app store? Is that the future of open data? Unclear, but many governments are presenting a platform on which third parties can make apps. And what they're beginning to invest in is not just the data to be open, but the standard on which that data is published, to have a definition, to have an interface. And this is what you see when you see websites that talk about API documentation. It's aimed at developers and coders, but I think more and more it's becoming part of the policy, part of the decision makers' realm to understand what is an API. So APIs are application programming interfaces. They're effectively the standard by which a program or a web application can talk to another one, including a data set. What are the permissions? How does it access, and what can it access? So it's like a key. In the analog and the physical world is locks and keys, and you can have a master key to unlock everything, or you can have certain keys that will unlock certain doors. So we think of the future of open data potentially as not just open data, but open standards around certain sectoral data sets. Really not quite sure. Okay. So that's happening in different forms all around the world. Next one, please. Forward one. Okay. So cities around Europe face a similar problem. If you're a football fan, a lot of football fans here, I assume, maybe? Great. So, you know, a lot of football fans, they travel to see the opposite games, and in the European Champions League, it's a really big thing. So if you're a Manchester United fan and you're playing Barcelona, you travel to see the game, you're taking your phone with you. You arrive in Barcelona, and I'm from Barcelona, and a lot of the information's in Catalan, which nobody from outside Barcelona speaks Catalan. But if not, it's in Spanish, not very common. So how do you navigate around? How does your app that tells you what the bus network is, that tells you the locations, really? So this is the idea of open standards, and we have it in transport. You have something called GTFS. So an app from Manchester that tells you the next bus in Manchester will still work in Barcelona in your language. But what about tourist information? What about directions to the Camp Nou for the football ground, or directions to the zoo or the old city? So this is the idea of standardizing the data formats on which we release data so that applications can share and work across standards, across countries. But not just across countries. In Africa, we've also begun to see a similar problem. So one of the core data sets that have been released on water is the water point data. And there was a workshop last summer with the Ministry of Water about how do all these different apps that are going to access the water point database, how do they interoperate? How do we ensure that we can use them to update the database? Do we have to have a custom configuration for each app and have a custom decision for which ones can read, which ones can write, how do we use them, how do we authorize them? And so the conclusion of the workshop was that we should have really an open standard for water point information. And that is not something just for Tanzania. This is something that could be shared across Africa, that could make sense in many other countries that are releasing similar water point data, which is the definition of what is a water point, what is a functional and non-functional water point. It's not as straightforward as you think. They have lots of little nuances depending on seasonality, depending on how long it has or hasn't had water. And how do you provide updates to whether that's working or not? Moving on. Location, location, location. They say that location is everything. But as we think about a mobile web, and particularly in Africa, if the majority of people access the internet via their phone, it's really got to be location-specific information. So the integration of geospatial data into open data initiatives, I think, is definitely a feature on the horizon for many, many open government data initiatives, and all sorts of applications. But really, as you browse the web through your phone, the idea is that location data should be seamless, should be as easy as any other data set. And until now, it's really been very difficult. If you want to know the statistics on the budget for your constituency or district, very difficult to find out on the portal. You have to really go through all the different lists of districts and then figure it out manually. But can we begin to encode that with the administrative boundaries of countries? Can we begin to encode that with the local addressing systems? Related to this is community data, citizen data. So in a neighborhood, everybody knows the problem they have in that neighborhood. Does the street light work? Is there a big pothole? Is there a frequent flooding problem? But when you scale up across the city or across to central agencies, that data gets lost. That data is not digital, it's not missing. So how can we harmonize, how can we integrate citizen sources with official sources? And you saw some really great projects. These are some pictures from the Romani Huria, where they're using UAV data, something called Open Aerial Map. They're using citizen data tagging buildings and something called OpenStreetMap. This is all different forms of citizen data that can complement official open data. Sensor data. Is the future of open data sensors? There's a lot of talk about the Internet of Things. Now, for those of you who haven't heard the term, it's really this idea that it's not just people that are creating data, but machines, televisions, computers, mobile phones, fridges, cars. All sorts of machines are expected to become more and more connected to the internet. Cisco, a large IT company, predicts that 50 billion devices will be connected by 2030. But finally, I think the idea of what is the future of open data is really in the people who are making the movement happen. And I was very impressed with Muturi. I'm just going to list people I've met personally. This is not a reflection of everybody. But people who are acting as change agents, people who really, they've been developers. This guy has made an app. He started working in code for Kenya. He's worked for the Open Institute. He's founded a company. He's advised. He's been in a think tank, in a university. People who are really at the forefront of pushing the agenda. And so I leave it with you that I think the future of open data in Africa is really in the hands of how do we engage and empower these change agents, these people who are showing us the way forward in their context. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So next we have Dr. Savita Baylor from the Web Foundation.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm going to keep it short. I think everyone's saturated now. So my name is Savita Baylor with the World Wide Web Foundation. And Jean asked us a very tough question. What do you think is the future of open data in Africa? And in reality, I see three futures. I see a future that I expect, I see a future that I'm a little worried about, and I see a future that the Web Foundation, myself, Nena, and my other colleagues would like to are working for. So last year, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web and the founder of our organization, said that he was often asked about what's the next big thing after the World Wide Web. And he says, the truth is, I cannot tell. Why? Because when I designed the web, I deliberately built it as a neutral, creative, and collaborative space, building on the openness the internet offered. My vision was that anyone, anywhere in the world, could share knowledge and ideas without needing to buy a license or ask permission from myself or from any CEO, government department, or committee. This openness unleashed a tidal wave of innovation, and it's still powering breakthroughs in science, commerce, culture, and much more besides. I don't think any of us can imagine a world without or before the World Wide Web. And this is particularly increasingly the case in Africa, where the next generation are digital natives with access to mobile internet. And this is a future that I see in open data in Africa. But the future is already happening. We've seen M-Pesa, we've seen Ushaidi. These are all innovations that have been created on this continent. Even the Africa Data Consensus, which Dozie will speak about, reached in Addis Ababa in March, was the one of its kind, pioneering invention. Investment in training and innovation labs will only help to distill this, the best of Africa's talents. But innovation can be a dirty word sometimes. I think techno-skeptics are very critical about innovation because it sounds like it's some high-tech invention. So one of the most important things, Edward talked about some of the people that he met, but one of the most important products that I saw was actually nothing to do with technology. It was the budget passport created to show using open budget data, but just in a completely non-technical format in Nigeria. So this, to me, illustrates absolutely the last mile of open data. There is a future that I'm a little worried about, and a future I'm afraid of. And many countries and organizations talk about open data, but they don't do it. The World Wide Web Foundation, my foundation, is neutral, but is never afraid to be critical, and that is our role. So we look at the interest in open data. We saw the interest in many sectors this morning. But we need to ask difficult questions. We'll be honest, we've seen a lot of cheating going on. We see governments putting out the easiest data sets. We've seen releasing old data. We've seen millions of dollars being spent on portals which are never used. We want to know what the impact of these are. What is the impact of putting out millions of data sets out there? It's what we call open washing. We talk about open by default in this community, but there is a danger of open by trend. You can be open in words, but closed in actions, and that's what we would like to change. So the future that the World Wide Web Foundation and I work for is this. We, together with the research team, which is based in Africa, with an Africa regional manager, will work on who is using open data, how is it being used, and how do we create the right climate, local and international, not set by the so-called developed countries, and principles including the Open Data Charter. So just as Sir Tim Berners-Lee said, we can't predict with certainty what's going to happen next, sorry Jean, but we can say that there will be a future driven by passionate people, men and women. We need to see much more of a female presence in the open data field, not just in Africa, around the world. And we need to use open data to go forward particularly towards achieving the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality. As my colleague Nana said yesterday, the best breakthroughs are driven by powerful economic and social interests. We were really happy yesterday to hear the President show commitment to an open data policy here in Tanzania. But there are things that I am sure will happen, and things that I hope and work for, such as sustainability and impact, but we cannot emphasize enough how much we need commitment to open data standards, legislation, and commitment. Thank you.
in light of Savita's remarks about gender, and I'll have you notice that the women outnumber the men on this panel, I'll next ask Dr. Flora Tibazara from Costec to come up and share her perspective.
So, thank you, Jean. My name is Flora Ismail Tibazara, and I work with the Tanzania Commission for Science and Technology. So this morning around 6 o'clock, I wake up and I see an email. And obviously an email on a Saturday morning from a work email is not the best of things, because it could be you're fired or you're promoted. Wasn't. I was allowed to dream this morning. Jean said, tell me, what do you think you want to see from open data? And that means open Pandora box, I can say whatever I want for the next 5 minutes. But what I'm going to tell you is a recurrent dream that I've had that didn't actually come from inside of me, but was instilled in me. And this happened slightly under 3 years ago in this same venue, but outside in some tents where we were allowed to sit down with heads of state in a very informal fashion, calling them by their first names, a mix, civil society, government, private sector, and these heads of state, including our own president. And we were allowed to share what we thought would transform the Commonwealth Partnership for Technology Management, the SMART Partnership. It was that event that was hosted in Tanzania. And we were allowed to share and think about what would cause socioeconomic transformation using technology. Okay? Coming from a technology institute, there are 2 recommendations that I took away from that have been bothering me. And over the last 4 days, listening to all the talks and interacting with you, I'm thinking, okay, open data has a big role to play in these 2 recommendations that I'm about to share with you. The first is that Africa needs technology roadmaps. We're endowed with a wealth of natural resources, but what do we do how do we plan and drive our development? We have great visions, we know where we want to go, but do we know how we want to get there? And what are the different futures or paths that we can take to actually get there? And technology roadmaps is a great way to get there if you know how to use foresight. So that's a capability thing that we need to see developed more and more in Africa. But data and information is behind this. When you look at countries that have benefited from using technology roadmaps, America, Japan, Korea, they have all enriched those roadmaps with data and information. And so when Dr. Ndemu was talking yesterday and saying, where is the data? I was like, oh man, my bubble burst. I want to build a technology roadmap for Tanzania. We're getting into a gas economy and I need a technology roadmap. My boss has it as a KPI. What do I do? So I'm sharing with you my dream, but I'm hoping you provide me with some answers as well. The second recommendation that we took away from that meeting was that, well, there's a list of them, but I'll share with you just this second one. And that was that we need to have from developing countries a greater capability for science diplomacy. And this means when we sit in international arena and negotiate, we are enriched with data and information from where we're coming from on what it is that we want to do and how we want to go about it. And when we sign on those dotted lines, we don't look back in hindsight and say, oh man, I should not have done that. I could have done this, I could have negotiated that. And so we think, for me, data and information openly shared will enrich our capabilities to be able to negotiate. So what is it that I think we should do? And what do I see actually happening in probably 10, 20, 15 years? I would wish for Africa to leapfrog its economic trajectory, move from the developing world into the developed world, naturally. I think we all think for that. But then what happens with this open data ecosystem that we're building? It means when you turn to your left or right, you're actually looking at a future employer, because what we're doing, as Edward has shown us with community mapping, is that we're engaging the community to now start start generating knowledge. They're being part of the knowledge generation scene, and so they will engage more, they will have more ownership, and then they might demand more. So we had a session yesterday talking about demand, but the more we engage them, particularly in the social services sector, we will see communities saying, I do not like the way you're making those decisions, and are we ready for that? Not that it's actually quite a good thing. I would like my mom to say, why are you doing that, as she always does. So, things I think in the future. We'll see new players, a lot more social entrepreneurs in Africa, which are not as prominent as they are, angel investors. We'll see a change coming from a research background. I would like to see a change in the knowledge dynamic. The contribution from Africa in terms of the global knowledge pool is not as substantive as it should be. We have a lot more things that we can contribute, and having access to all these high databases and access to open access journals will also allow us to contribute more. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. And for our next panelist, the head of the African Open Data initiatives for much of the year, Dr. Dempsey.
Thank you, Jean. Good afternoon, everybody. Now, let me go straight to the future of open data that I want to see in Africa, or that I expect to see. So far, correct me if I'm wrong, those of you who are more involved in this than I am, in Africa, the open data movement, if I would say that, is where there's an ICT agency that sets up an open data portal and then convinces other government departments or data providers to give the data to publish on the portal. Or in some cases, we'll even go and buy the data from them in order to put on the portal. That's what we have so far. Now, the future I see is when these agencies that provide data now see the value of making their data open and do not need the ICT agency to publish it for them, where they now understand the open standards and prepare and make their own data available in those open standards so that we can all access it directly. But knowing the continent that we are in, where majority do not have access to internet on a computer device, but through these even less able ones, we would like to see that data, or rather the information from those data, consumed in mobile devices. And the technology is already here. There's some governments that already offer services where you send an SMS to a particular number and the result comes back to you in an SMS. Now, how would it feel if people in the villages and rural areas who have access to SMS can consume data or information based on data in the form of SMS messages, where they send an SMS to a number, and that particular question comes to them in that little chunk of an SMS? That's where we then have people involved. Remember that the leave no one behind means that everybody should have access to the same information. But it doesn't say in the same format. The same information in different formats, depending on what device you can afford. And that's the challenge for all of us here, to make that possible, that those people who do not have access to computing devices can access the same information that you and I access, but in smaller chunks that they can digest. The challenge now is, what is the incentive for the data providers to provide the data in that open standard that everybody can access? That's for us to discuss and see how do we make that possible, that they would like to provide data without waiting for the African Development Bank or the World Bank to install a portal at the ICT agency. And we would like not just government departments, but corporations and NGOs to make the data available. Now imagine an NGO, especially in countries where they call ICT authority. Nobody would like to give their data to an authority to publish for them. That's even going to kill the initiative. So it's only when we get to a point where people start publishing their own data themselves without giving to somebody to publish for them, to upload for them, that we'll see the benefit of the open data movement. How many of you here have used a map service either on the internet or on an app, Google Map or anything like that? Almost everybody. Good. Now, remember that the GPS technology on which it based used to be the tool of surveyors in the 80s. Yes, it's surveyors, but they are not even involved in making it available to you and I. That's the same thing that should happen to data. Right now, it's the statisticians and data scientists who own data. We need to get to a point where there's a business model where there will be people who would like to make that data available. What do you pay Google to use Google Map? Nothing. Because they have a business model where they attract you to use Google Map and then they advertise to you. We need the same business model for data and information services. It's only when we get that and we unleash our young people. In our demographic studies, we say that Africa has a demographic dividend that other countries don't have. Unleash that young, educated group to start developing apps, to start seeing how to develop a business model to exploit data and repackage it. Forget the statistician, just like we forgot the surveyors in making Google Maps available. Forget the data scientists, just like we forgot the surveyors in making Google Maps available. Let's unleash our young people, find out how they think about data, show them what we need, and they will develop the apps that will sell this. It has to be a business model that sells it, not data portals and data platforms. Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap us up with a little story. I'm not going to have any words on any of my slides, but I want to talk about a future that doesn't have to be so far off. So I'm going to focus on a friend of mine. We'll pretend that Nampira lives in Lugazi district, just outside of Kampala in Uganda. So Nampira and her family own a farm, a small farm. And she has dreams, just like all of us, things she wants to do, things she wants for her children, safety, security, and hope for the future. And these are all things which open data can help to bring her to. So when she's out and her working in her farm, if she has access to a mobile phone, then she can actually look at a variety of things, that she can find information about the land around her. So for example, say they're in a drought or that her well has run dry. One of the things Nampira might want to do is to be able to dig for a new well, put in a new water point. And the way to find that today is a little bit of trial and error, but the way to find that in the future, a future not too far away, is actually being able to access that information from satellite data. And she only needs to be able to go to her mobile phone to find out where within her GPS vicinity, as Edward mentioned, that there are likely the most obvious places to put in a new water point. So from current satellite data allows us to be able to get to this information down to a hyper-local level. So Nampira now has the ability to actually get access to more water faster, to free up some of her children's labor in bringing that water in, and be able to expand her farm slightly. As she thinks about the new crops to plant, she might be looking at the same crops, or she might realize that going to the local market, she has access to new seed crops. And some of that isn't even something she has to do, but it's the fact that the people who manage the market, who work in the stores, are also getting access to open data that help them to understand what crops are most viable, what are giving their farmers in the area the most yield, and can put in new seed crops, even without the farmers having to ask for them, but that are going to give more produce to the community. Part of what she might have found is that there could be a blight on one of her banana crops. And so by looking at what that is, by perhaps sending an image from her mobile phone in, she's able to actually get a diagnosis and find that by combining some local oils and herbs, she's able to successfully fight that blight and make sure that she's able to bring in a full crop to market. Now we all know, for those of us involved in agriculture, that it's not just about getting the crop out of the ground or off the tree, but it's also about getting it to market. So part of what she might be looking at is what kind of road situation is there, and if there's better prices in a nearby market. So she could subscribe to a service like M-Farm that started in Kenya and is growing, that tells local farmers the prices in markets nearby that will give them the best capability. And also she can find out the status of roads that are being built. So she's going to be able to find out if certain roads are open up to new markets and that she's able to get her crop in there faster. When she finally does get to market and is able to sell all of her crops, she's able to make those exchanges using mobile money. That mobile money gives her access. It's not just about the convenience, but it means that the people she's working with, the people she's selling to, have more access to ready cash. And it means that the money that she gets, she can use in different ways. So one of the things Nampira wants to do is she wants to send her daughter to university. This seems like a really, really big dream to her. And yet she's able to use the mobile money in a way that she can save with a women's saving club in her village, to be able to inspire and encourage others to share and save that money for the future, and to be able to have her daughter take that phone, and when she goes into town, occasionally into Kampala, she can go to an incubator hub like Richard Zulu's Outbox, and be able to there get access to download different courses and be able to remotely do those courses and then upload the test results when she gets back. So eventually her daughter is able to actually get a much better education, even living in a rural, remote area, and be able to do that in a way that connects to expanded course curriculums. Now, all of this might seem like it's a far-off future, that some of this is really hard, but actually each of those steps that I talked about today is being done by innovators here in Africa today, by people who you met at the conference. They may or may not have told you all of their stories, by people you heard from here. All of these people are giving pieces of the open data ecosystem that are part of your future that is available today. So my call to you is to help all of those farmers, to help all of our friends, to help all of our communities with the things that are available to you today to create a better future, quite literally tomorrow. So we have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have a question? A comment? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I say a couple of things. I'm glad that you and one or two other people have looked at the future of open data in terms of land.
Sorry, could you speak a little more into the microphone? I'm sorry.
Can you hear me better now? Yeah. I'm glad that we have brought out land-related data as the open data of the future. In my assessment, in this part of Africa, that is the East African community, I would like to believe that the data should really be open, for which we should have open access, is all land-related data. And we mentioned community mapping. Yeah, okay, that's better. I mentioned community mapping. This gentleman next to you mentioned Manchester United going Barcelona. And he mentioned community mapping as well. And the lady from Tanzania, she mentioned the smart partnership movement. I'd like to make one or two comments on those. But firstly, let me thank the gentleman on the extreme right for telling us that the future of open data could give us indigestion, and that it needs to be packaged into swallowable pills, or you are going to work on that. That was actually my fear right from the beginning. My name is Professor Sam Tugiambika. I'm a statistician. I taught at Makerere University for close to 40 years, now retired. Land is a big problem here in East Africa. It may not be a problem elsewhere in Europe and the US. So we need, as open data, all land tenure information is very critical. It should be digitized and available for open access to everybody. Because in the 05, I led a team of consultants to develop a national land policy for Uganda. And we discovered that over 90% of the cases in local courts were to do with land ownership disputes. And since, and we estimated that by implication about over 70% of Ugandans were landlocked, land trapped in court cases to do with the land they own or don't own. So this data has been digitized, at least that which is titled, but it needs to be open so that everybody knows that this land is owned by so and so, and you can get this on pressing a button.
Excuse
Other
me, I'm
forms,
sorry, so that we can have time for more than one question? Could,
yeah, so
okay.
the others are land use planning, land use mapping, cities and urban areas. I should have gone to that group. We don't have really cities that are well planned. So if we have parameters for good planning or good urban planning, the information we will get online would be maps of well-planned cities and those which are not so well-planned, and in hot areas they're not well-planned. And finally, we could have maps show resource maps of the countries or the whole of the Great Lakes region, for instance. So I think land-related data, that should be really open data for everybody to access without let or hindrance. Thank you.
Thank you. So, okay, Renu, do you have a question too? And then we'll go to the panel.
Yes, one remark about your question. There's a new company just started, they're called Cadastra, and they are looking into developing software to manage land issues. And they have actually gathered a star team of people, ex-humanitarian OpenStreetMap team members, and so we're all very much looking forward to whatever they will release. So that is happening right now, and they plan to help in these kind of issues. My question is, Africa has leapfrogged twice the last 10, 15 years. Once, I think it was the first continent where we had more mobile phones than landlines. And secondly, mobile money was invented on the continent. Where do you see our next possibility to leapfrog again?
Great. So to the panel now. So one question about land registry and land use data and openness, and the second about leapfrogging ahead. Anyone?
So I'll respond to the one on leapfrogging. So I think we have a huge opportunity now in nanotechnology, especially for water filtration. So we have, that's the next best thing I think that we can consider.
The panel's very polite with each other.
Well, I have a hearing problem, that's why even with this gadget I still can't hear very well. Opening up land registry, right? Okay, you've asked the right question to the right person, because I'm actually a land surveyor by training. And I think the only person I know who has a PhD in land information management. So you're talking to the right person about land information. Yes, we actually at ECA in 2006, 2007, we did a publication on land management information in the knowledge economy. And one of the outcomes, one of the proposals from that symposium that led to that publication is that we need to open up land information to make it accessible to people who want to know what rights exist in the land. For one, it will reduce the fraudulent practices that we cannot document, but we all know there's lots of fraudulent practices in land transactions. There's no hard statistics on that, but everybody knows that it happens. By opening up land information, that will reduce that. That's one. But we also found in that study that for most of Africa, we should not base our land information on transaction records only, but on land use and land capability, because we want people to know what is the best form of use they should put their land to. So that should be one of the components of any open data we are looking at. How do we make land records accessible to people who want to deal in the land and help to develop a land market, but not for the purpose that most people say that if you develop a land market, you allow people to mortgage their land in order to get money to invest. No. Land market so that people who have more resources can invest in the land, but not necessarily as a way to mortgage the land. So we agree with you that yes, that has to be open, but we need to involve people who are experts in that area, not just statisticians, in fact, not even statisticians, because they don't understand the concepts and theories of land records and land markets. You need the people who are cadastral surveyors and land management people to get involved in how do we package land records to make it open for people to instill confidence in transactions in land and in investments in land. I don't know if that's good because I didn't hear the question very well because of my hearing problem.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, and so we will all be here afterwards to entertain any questions. And so I just want to say, be brave, dream big, and make a difference. Let's thank the panel.